Let's be honest, it was a difficult part. A guy who gets high, takes his shirt off, and doesn't get on with his wife.
Success, iconic roles, and high-profile marriages followed him everywhere he went. To the world. He seemed to have everything: the career, the glamour, the relationships people only dream of. But behind the perfect image, there was always a question fans whispered quietly. Who did Brad Pitt truly love the most? After decades of silence, guarded interviews, and carefully chosen words, Brad Pitt finally allowed the truth to surface. Not through a dramatic announcement, but through reflection. And what he revealed stunned even his most loyal fans. Because the woman he described wasn't just a former partner or a chapter in his romantic history. She was the one who shaped him, challenged him, and stayed with him emotionally long after the relationship ended. This wasn't about regret or scandal. It was about honesty, the kind that only comes with age, heartbreak, and self-awareness. Pitt spoke about timing, about mistakes, about how love can be real even when it doesn't last forever. And when you understand who she was to him, the confession becomes deeply emotional. This is the story of Brad Pitt's most meaningful love, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as a reflection on the woman who left the deepest mark on his heart. And once you hear the full story, you may never see his life, his choices, or his relationships the same way again, long before Brad Pitt became a global icon. Before the red carpets and blockbuster fame, he was simply a young man searching for meaning, connection, and a place where he truly belonged. When people look back at his romantic history today, they often focus on the most famous names and the most public relationships. But the truth is far more layered and far more human. In his early rise to fame, Brad Pitt was overwhelmed by sudden attention. Overnight, he went from anonymity to obsession. The world projected fantasies onto him, but inside he felt unprepared for the emotional weight that came with it. He has admitted in later reflections that success arrived faster than maturity, and that imbalance shaped the way he loved. It was during this fragile period that he met the woman who would quietly become the emotional center of his life. She wasn't just someone he dated, she was someone who saw him before the world decided who he was supposed to be. Their connection wasn't built on celebrity or image. It was built on late conversations, shared uncertainty, and a sense of grounding that Pitt had never experienced before. What made this relationship different was not intensity, but clarity. With her, Pitt felt understood rather than admired. He didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be Brad Pitt. He could simply exist. And for a man whose life was becoming increasingly artificial, that authenticity was everything. As his career accelerated, the relationship faced pressures few couples could survive. Long separations, conflicting priorities, the constant intrusion of public attention. Pitt has since acknowledged that, at the time, he lacked the emotional tools to protect something fragile while navigating such chaos. He was ambitious, restless, and still learning who he was, and yet, even as the relationship ended, it never truly left him. In later interviews, Pitt has spoken about timing, how love can be real and still fail when people meet before they're ready. He has admitted that he didn't fully understand what he had until it was gone. Not because the relationship ended badly, but because it ended too soon. What makes his later confession so powerful is not that he named her publicly. He didn't. It's that he finally admitted the emotional truth, that some loves don't fade with time. They evolve. They become reference points, quiet markers against which all future relationships are measured. For years, Pitt tried to recreate that sense of peace in other relationships, often confusing intensity with intimacy. He has reflected openly on how fame complicated his emotional life, how he sometimes chased distraction instead of connection, and how he learned, painfully, that love requires presence, not perfection. This woman represented something simple but rare: emotional safety. And losing that changed him. As Pitt matured, faced personal struggles, and rebuilt himself from public and private failures, he began to understand what that relationship had taught him. It taught him humility. It taught him accountability. And most importantly, it taught him that love isn't about possession. It's about recognition. That realization didn't come in his youth. It came decades later, after heartbreak, reflection, and growth. And when he finally acknowledged that she was the love of his life, It wasn't nostalgia speaking, it was wisdom. This wasn't a confession meant to reopen the past. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had always lived inside him. A recognition that some people shape us not by how long they stay, but by how deeply they change us. And for Brad Pitt, she was the one who did exactly that. As Brad Pitt's career exploded, something subtle but devastating began to happen. The very success he had worked toward his entire life started pulling him away from the person who mattered most. Fame didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a storm, loud and relentless, reshaping every corner of his existence. Suddenly, his life was no longer his own. Schedules were decided by studios. Movements were followed by cameras. Private moments became headlines. And the quiet relationship that once grounded him was forced to survive in an environment it was never meant for. Pitt has later reflected on how unprepared he was for that kind of attention. He was still discovering who he was as a man, yet the world had already decided who he should be. The pressure to live up to an image, the leading man, the heartthrob, the symbol, began to suffocate the emotional connection he valued most. The woman he loved didn't fall for the image. She fell for the man behind it. And as that man slowly disappeared beneath expectations and ambition, the relationship began to suffer. Long separations became normal. Film sets replaced shared routines. Conversations turned brief and distracted. What once felt effortless now required work Pitt didn't yet know how to do. He has since admitted that he mistook freedom for fulfillment and ambition for purpose. Fame didn't just take his time, it altered his priorities. As his career climbed, opportunities demanded constant movement. New roles, new locations, new circles of influence. And with each step upward, the emotional distance between them quietly grew. Not because love faded, but because presence did. Pitt has spoken about how he avoided slowing down, afraid that if he stopped, he might confront feelings he wasn't ready to face. Commitment felt heavy. Responsibility felt overwhelming. And instead of addressing the growing cracks, he kept moving forward, convincing himself that success would eventually bring happiness. It didn't. When the relationship ended, it wasn't marked by betrayal or explosive conflict. It ended with sadness, confusion, and a sense of unfinished truth. Pitt later described moments like this as the most painful, when love is still there. But timing ice and single quotes T. In the years that followed, he carried that loss quietly. Outwardly, his life looked extraordinary. Internally, something felt unresolved. He entered new relationships, experienced intense romances, and even built families. But deep down, he sensed that something fundamental had been left behind. Only with time did he begin to understand why. Pitt has since reflected that he was emotionally unavailable during his early fame. Not intentionally, but unconsciously. He didn't yet possess the self-awareness required to protect something fragile while standing in the spotlight. And by the time he did, the moment had passed. This realization didn't come with bitterness. It came with accountability. He has openly acknowledged that love requires maturity, and maturity often arrives too late. That insight became one of the most defining lessons of his life. Looking back, Pitt doesn't speak of regret, he speaks of responsibility. He understands now that the relationship didn't fail because it wasn't real. It failed because he wasn't ready to be the man it required, and that is what makes his later confession so powerful. It isn't about longing for the past. It's about honoring it. Recognizing that some relationships shape us precisely because they show us who we are not yet capable of being. For Brad Pitt, that love became a quiet compass, guiding his growth, influencing his self-reflection, and reminding him that success without emotional presence is empty. And though the world moved on, that lesson stayed with him, waiting for the moment when he was finally brave enough to say it out loud. As Brad Pitt grew older, something shifted inside him. The noise of fame softened. The constant chase for validation lost its power. And in that quieter space, memories he had buried for decades began to resurface, not as regret, but as clarity. For years, Pitt avoided labeling any single relationship as the one. Not because he didn't feel deeply, but because he understood how easily words could be twisted. Every confession became a headline. Every reflection became speculation. So instead, he spoke carefully, choosing lessons over names, growth over gossip. But eventually, honesty demanded more. In recent reflections, Pitt began speaking about a love that shaped him more than any other. He described it not with passion, but with respect. Not with longing, but with gratitude. He spoke of a woman who knew him before he understood himself. Someone who didn't want to be saved by fame or impressed by success. What made this confession so powerful was its restraint. There was no dramatic reveal. No public declaration. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some relationships define us in ways that time cannot erase. Pitt admitted that for many years he didn't allow himself to fully process that loss. He stayed busy. He stayed productive. He stayed distracted. But eventually, distraction runs out, and truth remains. Through personal struggles, public scrutiny, and emotional reckoning, he began to see the pattern clearly. He had spent much of his life running from stillness. And the love he lost was rooted in exactly that: stillness, presence, authenticity. He realized that he had spent years searching for what he once had, emotional grounding without fully acknowledging where it first came from. That realization didn't bring pain. It brought peace. Because for the first time, Pitt understood that love doesn't have to last forever to be the most important. Some loves are meant to teach, not to stay. Some people enter our lives to show us who we are capable of becoming, not to walk beside us forever. The confession came not from heartbreak, but from growth. He didn't say she was perfect. He didn't say the relationship would have survived. What he said, indirectly but unmistakably, was that she represented a version of himself he lost and spent years trying to rediscover. In acknowledging her importance, Pitt also acknowledged his own mistakes. His emotional absence. His fear of vulnerability. His tendency to escape instead of engage. That level of accountability is rare, especially for someone whose life has been dissected by the world for decades. And that is why his words resonated so deeply. Fans didn't react with shock. They reacted with understanding. Many recognized the same truth in their own lives. The person they loved before they were ready. The relationship that didn't fail because of a lack of love, but because of timing. Pitt's confession wasn't about reopening the past. It was about closing a chapter inside himself. A chapter that had remained unfinished because he hadn't yet found the language or the courage to acknowledge it. And in doing so, he revealed something deeply human. That growth often comes from loss, and wisdom often arrives long after the moment it could have changed everything. This confession didn't rewrite his history. It completed it. And as he stood in that honesty, something remarkable happened. The story stopped being about fame, relationships, or regret. It became about self-awareness. Because sometimes the most important love of your life isn't the one you end up with, it's the one who teaches you how to love when you finally become ready. By the time Brad Pitt finally allowed himself to speak honestly about the love that shaped him most, he was no longer searching for answers, he was accepting them. Age had given him something fame never could: perspective. And with that perspective came a quiet peace that only arrives when a person stops running from their own truth. Pitt no longer describes love as something dramatic or consuming. He speaks of it as something steady, something patient, something rooted in presence. And that understanding, he admits, came directly from the relationship he lost. Before he knew how to protect it, what made that love endure wasn't memory, it was influence. It shaped how he viewed commitment, how he understood accountability, how he learned to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. For years, he chased excitement, mistaking intensity for intimacy. Only later did he realize that the love he once had offered, something far more rare, emotional safety. In the years following that relationship, Pitt's life unfolded publicly. Marriages, family, heartbreak, personal struggles, all under relentless scrutiny. And through it all, that early love remained a quiet benchmark. Not a comparison meant to diminish others, but a reminder of what authenticity felt like before everything became complicated. As he faced personal reckoning later in life, Pitt began focusing on responsibility rather than blame. He has spoken about the importance of growth, sobriety, and self-awareness, not as achievements, but as ongoing work. And it was during this period of deep reflection that the truth became impossible to ignore. That love didn't fail because it wasn't strong enough. It failed because he wasn't ready. Accepting that truth allowed him to forgive himself. And forgiveness, he discovered, is what finally allows people to move forward without carrying the weight of what might have been taught today. Those close to Pitt describe a man who values simplicity over spectacle. Someone who protects his inner life carefully. Someone who understands that peace is earned, not given. His creative work reflects that change. Quieter, more intentional, more emotionally grounded. And that is the final gift that love gave him. It didn't last forever, but it taught him how to live with honesty. It showed him what it feels like to be truly seen and how rare that is. It became the foundation for the man he eventually grew into. When Pitt finally acknowledged that she was the love of his life, it wasn't a declaration of longing. It was a declaration of gratitude. Gratitude for a connection that arrived early, taught deeply, and stayed quietly, present long after it ended, because some loves are not meant to be held forever. They are meant to shape us and then let us go. And in the end, that may be the most powerful kind of love of all.